Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series. This is not a series on postmodernism. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is postmodern architecture. So, we start the discipline-specific story of postmodernism with architecture, as this is likely the clearest example of the motivations for the movement and some of the elements which will appear in some of the more abstract versions of postmodernism. So we're shifting now from kind of some definitions of terms that we did in those first three videos to three specific positions in art. This is architecture. We'll cover performance next, and then postmodern aesthetics writ large. Now, according to Jenks, the language of postmodern architecture, modern architecture died in St. Louis, Missouri on July 15, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts, when the famous Pruitt-Ego scheme, or rather several of its slab blocks, were given a final coup de grace by dynamite. No other position in postmodernism will have such a clear definition and distinctive line between the modernist and the postmodernist. But to understand this quote and to understand postmodern architecture, we need to first understand what it was a reaction towards, namely modern architecture. So, modern architecture emerged following the First World War and rose to prominence during the mid-20th century. Modernist architects had both practical commonalities, use of glass, steel, and reinforced concrete, but also common aesthetics and even ethical positions, such as functionalism, that form should follow function, that the shape of something should be based on what it is doing. Modernists rejected classical styles and ornamentation in favor of minimalist, clean, unadorned structures. However, the modernists did not solely adopt this particular style. They actually claimed that there was a moral duty to do so. They claimed that there was an objective moral truth to be found in the materials that they use. There was a right way to use wood, a right way to use steel, glass, or concrete. They claimed that there's a correct way to design buildings, which adornment and ornamentation obstructed. This carried over into fashion, with clothes that were designed solely for their functionality, not for their appearance. Visual art was the process of extracting the true, real form from the material, which is why many modernist sculptures or paintings have very clear, formulaic, geometric lines in them. According to the modernists, we could use reason to discover the right way to design buildings, clothes, or anything by discarding irrational ornamentation and embracing only the form which best served the function of the building. It's important to understand this because modernism in architecture is not simply, oh, this is one way we decided to make architecture. It is a philosophical position that says this is the right way to make architecture. This position was defended through an appeal to the limited resources available on the planet, a pushback against excessive consumption, and a lack of housing for the poor. If there is a limited amount of housing, we can't be spending the limited space we have or the limited materials we have with all of this excess ornamentation, with making buildings in strange shapes. We have to use our space as absolutely efficiently as possible. Modernists thought that they had an ethical mandate to do more with less. However, where the modernists claimed that less is more, the postmodernists claimed that less is a bore. For the postmodernists, rows and rows of plain, identical buildings stripped of all ornamentation was depressing and dehumanizing. Modernist building might be cost efficient, but people want more than a cheap house. They want a unique one. For the postmodernist, there was no one right way to design buildings. Postmodern architects rejected the modernist aesthetics as well as the underlying theories that underpinned them. Aesthetically, postmodern architects embraced ornamentation, complexity, bright colors, humor, and the marriage of modern and classical styles. Postmodern architecture is often playful, mocking, or satirical, and doesn't shy away from preferencing style over simple function. Postmodern buildings do not follow the modernist rules of simplicity and asceticism. Postmodern buildings include the buildings of a building shaped like a pair of binoculars, buildings that appear to bend or contort in strange ways, buildings that create optical illusions, buildings that compare giant Greek and Roman columns with very clearly modernist structures of concrete, steel, and more. These buildings often use double coding symbolism, which means that they have one interpretation to the general public or to the popular view, and another different interpretation, meaning, or connections to architects that understand the field and understand the references that an individual building is making. And we will see this concept of double coding come up time and again in postmodernism. However, postmodernist architects did not merely change the style of architecture. The underlying assumptions of modernism, that you had an ethical mandate to do more with less, were questioned as well. For the postmodernists, there is no moral imperative to design buildings in a particular style. There is no true form hidden in the materials that the architect is trying to discover through rational logic. People can value buildings which have ornamentation even if they are not the most cost-effective. In fact, for the postmodernist, buildings that are unique are often more popular and gain more acclaim than buildings that fit a kind of minimalist code of what you should do. For the postmodernists, the case is that forcing people to live in identical, uniform buildings robs them of a certain element of their humanity and their individuality, and allowing a certain level of ornamentation is not frivolous, but is actually embracing someone's right to be an individual and have something interesting about their building. The postmodernist critique is more than just claiming that the modernist architecture is boring, though they certainly made that critique, but rather that the project of finding the true or rational form of buildings is nonsense. For the postmodernist, as much as the modernists may be attempting to completely divorce their style from the past or historical influences of classical periods, they are inevitably culturally influenced. They are making choices that cannot be perfectly rationally determined. They are engaged in a creative pursuit, not a rationally dictated one. And there is not a rationally right way to design a building that is completely objective. Now, to give you a sense of some of the themes we talked about in the first video about postmodernism, here we're going to talk about a few of the themes in modernist and postmodernist architecture and how they fit in. So we have modernism on one side and postmodernism here. With modernist architecture, you have a rejection of classical styles. So you have the use of steel, glass, and concrete structures, whereas postmodernist architecture is a marriage of classical and modern styles. You'll see Greek Ionic columns next to clearly modern steel and glass structures, or paired together in the same building. For the modernist, form follows function. They eliminate the extra ornamentation that does not add to the function. The form is what's important, or the function is what's important, rather, what the building is supposed to do, and the form should only follow what that is intended to do. Whereas for the postmodernist, form is essential. Ornamentation is an important part of the building. The form that the building's taking, the design, the look of the building is just as important as its function. For the modernist, works transcend place or culture. You'll see cubes, you'll see abstract geometric shapes that, according to the modernist, are completely divorced from any individual culture, any individual ideas, but are actually the rational way to use a particular material based on principles of logic and mathematics and physics. Whereas for the postmodernist, all works are necessarily culturally situated, including those cubes that the modernists were making. An inclusion of real objects and reference to previous styles is an important part of architecture, and postmodernist architecture often references and makes connections to those previous works explicitly. For the modernist, simplicity is important. Less is more was a kind of mantra of the modernists, or for the postmodernists, less is a bore. Complexity is good. Adding intricacy and difference to structures makes them more interesting and engaging. Complexity is a good thing. For the modernists, conformity is important. Utility over uniqueness. Everything should be the same. It should be useful. Once we find the most useful design, we should use that everywhere. We should not have unique, identifiable buildings. Whereas for the postmodernists, individualism is important. Breaking the rules makes things interesting, makes people feel like they actually want to live somewhere. For the modernist, you have faith in meta-narratives. There is one right way to do architecture, and we are discovering that right way, this meta-narrative linking together all of the individual instances of individual buildings. Those can be compared against that meta-narrative, that story of the right way to make architecture. Whereas for the postmodernists, there's skepticism of meta-narratives. There are many right ways to design the best building or a right building. There's not one good building that we're going to copy paste all throughout a neighborhood. For the modernist, art represents reality. The true form of materials can be understood and drawn out. The architecture is a representation of what those materials should be, what the reality actually is. Whereas for the postmodernist, art represents itself. Buildings are actually, even the modernist buildings, are referencing previous styles, they're referencing previous cultures, and that's what they should be doing. And many postmodernist structures do exactly that, with the pairing of classical and modernist styles, but also with the referencing and kind of the pastiche, the taking of particular parts of previous architectures to tell a story that maybe only the initiated would understand, but is still a story being told and a reference of one piece of art to another piece of art. For the modernist, architecture is original ideas. It is dropping the old, classical, culturally specific styles and creating something that is original, that transcends culture, that is completely separate and is completely rationally defined. Whereas for the postmodernist, you are engaging in pastiche and parody, building sample styles from old eras, and can make jokes or look amusing or funny or engaging in a different way, as opposed to being original and rationally dictated. For the modernist, buildings should be high art. They should conform to the rules of high art, and that it's not what someone wants out of a building in terms of its look that matters. Rather, it's the rules that descend solely from the function of the building that should conform it. Whereas in postmodernism, popular art matters. Buildings should be places people are excited to live in. The popularity of the building matters. The postmodernist. What do you think? Should buildings be designed without any frills? Are there rationally derivable rules about how to design a building that follow from its function? If there are those rules, do we have a moral imperative to follow such rules? And should we be only creating buildings that all look identical, that fit that perfect blueprint? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you liked this video and you want to see more, and hit the notification bell if you want to catch all the videos in this postmodernism series. It's a big 14-part series. We're going to be doing it for quite a while. So hit the notification bell if you want to be notified anytime we post a new video, and stay up on all the elements of postmodernism. This is just one of the many parts of postmodernism, so there are many more to come. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.